Good morning, everyone. I'm Laura Barrera, Managing Editor of No-Till Farmer Magazine, and I'd like to welcome you to this morning's No-Till Farmer webinar. Today, we are going to hear from Lacrosse Seed cover crop lead and agronomist Scott Woltman on what we've learned about herbicide rotational restrictions in the last 5 years. Today's No-Till Farmer webinar is sponsored by Lacrosse Seed, producers of the Soil First Premium cover crop seed. We want to thank Lacrosse Seed for making today's webinar possible. We also want to thank our presenter, Scott Woltman, for sharing in today's webinar what chemistries cause the most concern for summer and fall cover crop seeding, as well as takeaways for spring burn down applications and more. Before we turn things over to Scott, there are a couple of housekeeping items we want to make you aware of. On your screen, there's an orange box with a white arrow inside of it. You can click on that and it will open up to reveal a question or comment field that will allow you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. At the end of the webinar, we will look to answer as many questions as possible. If for any reason the webinar is disrupted or you seem to be disconnected from the webinar, just go back to the invitation email you received and rejoin the webinar through the link in the email, just as you did today when you logged in. With that said, thanks again for joining us, and I will turn the controls over to Scott Woltman. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Laura. Appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone today. Like Laura said, my name is Scott Woltman, and I'm a certified crop advisor and the Eastern cover crop lead for Lacrosse Seed. Hopefully today we'll have a chance to highlight a few things that our team here at Lacrosse Seed has been seeing and hearing the last few years, like Laura mentioned. I realize that the title indicates that we're going to talk about rotational restrictions of herbicides. However, we will be diving into a few different topics related to herbicides and their overall considerations. Before we get to the agenda, I just want to give a shout out here since I'm giving this webinar from an area north of Indianapolis. I wanted to showcase one of our guys here. The tractor you see in the drill is just from up the road. A gentleman of ours was planting ryegrass, no-tilling ryegrass into soybeans this last fall. So I wanted to put that picture up on the screen. So hopefully everybody can see the agenda. What we'll do today is we'll have a little short justification for the topic of today's webinar. We'll get into why we're even talking about this in general. Then I'll give a brief explanation of herbicide classifications. And my thought there is if we group herbicides this way in a classification standpoint, this may shed a little bit more light on how they work and which ones are more of a concern when planting cover crops. We'll talk about burn down, and burn down options will kind of be the conduit to how we discuss other herbicide classes. And that'll give way to diving in, albeit kind of a shallow dive, but we will dive into what herbicides seem to be more prone to causing carryover problems. And then we'll end the conversation with talking about how feeding cover crops kind of changes the conversation entirely. So let's get started. So I do work, like I said, for Lacrosse Seed, and the reason why our company is so interested in herbicide interactions is because of who we work and partner with. Because we market our products to ag retail and to ag professionals, it demands that we not only try to give our dealers pertinent and practical information, but our dealers also provide us with valuable intel on what they are seeing from the field. Together, I think our message is all about getting the right information in the hands of growers. Now, herbicide interactions, in my opinion, isn't the biggest barrier to cover crop adoption, and that's kind of also backed by the SARE survey, but it is something that justifies planning for sure. Now, our territory, which is there on the screen, is fairly large, but I'll concentrate this webinar on corn and soybean herbicides typically used across the Midwest. One thing that we're trying to accomplish, and I hope this webinar reflects that, is that we think there's value in serving as somewhat of a clearinghouse for information. You'll hear from me throughout the talk today about how much great work is being done out there, and how much has already been done on defining many of the herbicide challenges today. There's a lot of Midwestern land-grant universities that have provided information that we use today, every day in the field. Much of this information you'll hear is our team at La Crosse. It's our take and our opinion on how these herbicides are working. And we certainly understand that there are many variables out there that could have several people disagreeing with what we see, and it certainly leaves room for debate. And that's okay. We can talk about herbicide restrictions for 8 hours or a couple days if we wanted to, but we only have an hour, so we'll dive in. I think everyone recognizes some of the basic differences in herbicides. A big one being some have residual properties and some do not. Many of our herbicide properties also have, many of our burn down herbicides also have residual activity as well. Residuals are used in just about all the major cash crops, and most residuals provide somewhere between 6 and 12 weeks of weed control. It goes without saying that understanding the different residual options is important to making cover crops work. So there's a lot of complexity for sure. With all herbicides, it's important to understand the mode of action, not only because they work differently, herbicides work differently within the plant, but mixing different chemicals with different modes of action can prevent some herbicides from actually working as effective as if they were used alone. But also because utilizing different modes of action is important to minimize the development of herbicide-resistant weed populations. And I think we all understand that there's a lot of premixes being used today, and premixes are largely comprised of 2 or more different modes of action, all working synergistically to help reduce weed pressure. But again, when using a premix, that adds even more complexity to potentially a carryover concern. So let's talk about cover crop termination. What needs to be considered? I think the weather is probably the biggest consideration. Cool and cloudy conditions often delay herbicide activity, and dry weather can increase carryover potential. Just about all of our burn down herbicides work best when plants are actively growing. And especially herbicides like glyphosate, herbicides that are in the class of growth regulators, our ALS inhibitors, and our HPPD inhibitors. And we'll talk more about those in a second. Besides the weather, there are other factors obviously that influence how termination is effective or not too, like how big is the cover crop you're trying to kill, what cash crop are you going to plant next, and many other factors. So we're going to get started. We're going to discuss, I think I have 10 different herbicide classes to kind of go over. And I think these 10 do a pretty good job of representing a large percentage of what's being used in the industry today. First, we'll talk about glyphosate. Glyphosate is a group 9 herbicide, and it's a common burn down option. EPSP is basically the enzyme responsible for the production of amino acids in the plant. Glyphosate kills plants by barring that production of amino acids, which usually takes up to a couple weeks to completely kill the plant. That chemistry needs to get to the growing point of the plant to be effective. So anything that prevents glyphosate from translocating within the plant will ultimately reduce its effectiveness, like cold and cloudy weather, the timing of application, or mixing glyphosate with other herbicides or other burn down herbicides that don't kill quite as quickly, that kill quicker than glyphosate. One example would be paraquat. You throw paraquat and glyphosate together, the paraquat's going to kill quicker than the glyphosate, and you're going to reduce the effectiveness of glyphosate altogether. Furthermore, there are plenty of instructions to follow when using glyphosate, and we'll go over a few of those that are important when trying to terminate annual ryegrass, like the right rate, using the right kind of water, the right spray volume, several factors there. But glyphosate doesn't have any soil activity, so we really don't have a carryover concern with glyphosate. Next, we'll move to the growth regulators. These are group 4 herbicides, and they have a place in cover crop burn down applications too. 2,4-D, dicamba are a couple options that fall into this category of herbicides. They work primarily on legumes and other broadleaves. These herbicides kill plants by disrupting metabolic processes within the plant, usually taking at least a week for plants to die. We have, at our team at La Crosse, have noticed some trouble that these herbicides have with brassica control, and we'll get into that more in a little bit as well. We typically don't see any carryover issues with the growth regulators, although 2,4-D can cause some problems depending on organic matter and soil pH. Next, we'll talk about glufosinate. Glufosinate is a group 10 herbicide that kills plants by disrupting ammonia recycling, which causes photosynthesis and other processes in the growing plant to stop. Just like glyphosate, the control of plants using glufosinate is greatly affected by the weather. So plants need to be actively growing to achieve good results. Plenty of sunlight and good spray volume coverage is needed. Next, we'll talk about paraquat. Paraquat is a group 22 herbicide. It's another burn down possibility. Paraquat is a photosynthetic inhibitor, which turn death usually happens before any of the herbicide can be translocated very far within the plant. And because paraquat is a contact killer, kind of like glufosinate, good coverage is needed to get control. Broadleaf control is more assured than with grasses, where with grasses, a second application may be needed due to regrowth. Paraquat has, again, no soil activity, so carryover isn't an issue. We'll move on to the PPO inhibitors, which are group 14 herbicides. So PPOs would include products like Sharpen and Reflex. These products stop the biosynthesis or the production of chlorophyll and other pigments in the plant. PPOs typically work better on broadleaves than grasses, and affected plants usually die within a week or so. PPOs are another contact killer, so spray volumes need to be increased. Carryover concerns are fairly valid with PPOs, especially on fall cover crops, and we'll get into more detail on these PPOs in just a little bit. Next would be the group 5 herbicides, which are the triazines, and they're part of the photosystem or photosynthetic inhibitors as well. These herbicides include atrazine, simazine, metribuzin. These herbicides translocate differently than glyphosate in the plant, which means that post-applications of these products usually are not as effective. Dry weather can definitely reduce their effectiveness too, but because of their residual activity, consideration for the following cash crop and obviously a cover crop is important because these can cause some injury. Now we'll move on to the ALS inhibitors. So ALS, which are group 2 herbicides, they encompass a large number of products that are very common for broadleaf control in corn and soybeans. There are many different herbicide families within this classification. ALS herbicides kill plants by stopping the enzyme responsible for production of branch chain amino acids. Just like glyphosate, ALS products need to translocate within the plant to be effective. So just like glyphosate, weather plays a crucial role in how successful they are when talking about termination. ALS inhibitors, however, are widely known for causing some issues potentially in late summer or fall planted cover crops. And we'll get into ALS inhibitors just like PPOs and just like the triazines in a few minutes. The next group would be our ACCase inhibitors, which are typically used for post-grass control. They typically take about 2 weeks for plants to completely die. Examples of these herbicides would be your Selects and Post Plus and Post, some of those. Like other herbicide families, ACCase inhibitors work best on actively growing plants. In dry conditions, though, expect these herbicides to have a little bit of a reduced effect. Using group 1s, like ACCase, alongside 2,4-D and other growth regulators, we've definitely seen that does decrease their activity. It decreases their efficacy, which simply means they just don't work as well. We do on occasion see some carryover issues with HCCH inhibitors, but that's typically only on grass cover crops. And we'll get into that more in a little bit as well. HPPD inhibitors, which come from the pigment inhibitors class. They are group 27 herbicides, and they include products like Balance and Callisto, Lotus, and Impact. They kill plants by preventing the production of pigments that protect the chlorophyll, which ends up basically bleaching the plant or turning it white. The industry typically or often mixes HPPDs with other herbicide classes like triazines for better success. But HPPDs can show some injury to cover crops as well. So we'll dive into that in a bit. And the last group would be the seedling growth inhibitors. In this group, it's made up of, in this class, we're made up of a couple groups. The group 15 herbicides, which are the shoot inhibitors. That would be your acetochlor, your S-metolachlor, kind of your dual and your harness type products. The shoot inhibitors are usually applied pre-emergence or very early post. The root inhibitors, like Prowl, Truffland, they're typically incorporated into the soil to reduce volatility and photodecomposition. Both the shoot and the root inhibitors can cause carryover injury to cover crops. So we kind of went through very quickly the 10 classes, and we'll hit 10 of the major classes of herbicides. And I know that was we kind of had a slant on termination there a little bit. So before we go much further, I want to just summarize what our team typically uses for some basic burn down recommendations. Now, the chart you see in front of you was taken from the University of Wisconsin and Penn State University, although we've made a few edits based on our experiences in the field. A couple things that I just want to highlight. Number one, you can see, I'll just do that again, you can see that the 2,4-D, we've taken it out of brassica control. Not to say that it doesn't work. It's just across the board in a lot of areas in the Midwest. 2,4-D on brassicas, we've really seen some issues with it having much luck. It really showed its head a couple of years ago in rapeseed control. Winter rapeseed, it's just 2,4-D or even dicamba. We've really seen some issues with that working very well at all. Another thing I wanted to highlight, which comes up a lot, is crimson clover control. The only consistent approach to terminating crimson clover, and again, I'm talking about consistency here, in our opinion, assuming that the crimson clover overwinters, is through the use of herbicides. Mowing doesn't work. Rolling and crimping crimson clover doesn't work as well. So herbicide use, and again, crimson clover isn't the hardest thing in the world to kill. Glyphosate or a growth regulator typically work pretty well. Next thing I want to highlight is rolling and crimping cereal rye. Just real briefly here, using a roller crimper to terminate cereal grains like fall rye. The industry, I think, talks about flowering as kind of the ideal time, but we actually get a lot better results if we do it a little bit later at the milk or dough stage, which usually happens several days or a week or so later. Could be even longer, but just to think that we need to do it at flowering, we've seen a much better luck if we can delay that a little bit longer. And then lastly, just want to kind of highlight annual ryegrass control. You've heard it many times, I know, and there's been a lot of great work done by the Oregon Ryegrass Growers Commission and all the work done by several people in the industry like Dan Towery and Mike Plummer. But these 9 or 10, you could add another one in there, steps are crucial to get annual ryegrass terminated. Whatever you're using, a lot of guys use glyphosate, you could use Sharp and different things. You need to use the full rate. You need to correct by using AMS. You need to make sure your pH in your water is correct. That's a big deal as well. When we're talking about Droplet size, we need to shoot for a medium droplet size, and typically we're going to get that by using a standard or a flat fan nozzle. We need to keep our spray volumes to around 10 gallon per acre. Soil temperatures need to be 45 degrees Fahrenheit and climbing. And then air temperatures need to be 55 to 60 degrees during the day, and at least 40 degrees at night for a minimum of three to four, maybe even a week. We need to have those air temperatures at night staying warmer to get glyphosate to work. Maybe one of the most important thing is we need to spray around noon if possible, because glyphosate really needs about 4 hours to work to translocate within the plant. And then lastly, if we're going to use a second application, it's probably best to wait at least a week or two, which it's going to take that long to figure out if you got the ryegrass actually controlled anyway. So those are important. I see in my travels a lot of ryegrass that's been terminated, only to drive by that same location 3 or 4 weeks later, and there it is greening back up again. So I know there's a lot of challenges out there, but if we follow these guidelines, I think we'll be in much better shape. So I think it's incredibly important also to recognize some of the awesome resources that are out there that really spell out everything that I'm getting ready to talk about in a little bit more detail. And you'll be able to capture this slide as part of the presentation. But I'm just adding a few resources from some of our land-grant universities out there, from the work that Purdue and Dr. Curran at Penn State, the work that they've done at University of Wisconsin, and Dr. Bradley at Missouri, and all the folks at Nebraska and Iowa State, and Dr. Shaner at Michigan State, with the work he's put together. All of these resources are really, 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 really good. And our team relies on this information, as do our dealers across the country, to kind of help steer us in the right direction. And I would encourage everybody on this webinar, if you don't have these bookmarked on your computer, I would make sure that they are, because they're really good resources to turn to. And again, you'll be able to capture these after the call. So as we're talking about herbicide carryover, what really affects herbicide carryover? Well, I think we all understand that the environment does. The amount of moisture we get, typically the more rain, the more moisture we get, the less concerns we have for carryover. Not always, but typically. Temperature plays a role, and so does soil type and soil texture. Soil pH. In some cases, depending on the herbicide, a low pH soil can enhance the opportunity for carryover, and in other herbicides, a higher pH can enhance the opportunity for carryover. So soil pH is obviously a consideration as well. It goes without saying that herbicide chemistry and the application rate is important. And I'll be talking about half-life of herbicides, but if the half-life of a herbicide is too long, well, that means that it's supplying really good residual, which is good. That's what herbicides were made to do. They're made to keep weeds at bay, and residual herbicides are meant to, again, last 6, 8, maybe up to 12 weeks of residual control. So a longer half-life is good. However, you do have more of an issue with carryover. Whereas the other side of it would be, if a half-life is too short on a herbicide, then the chemical is rarely used, quite frankly, because it simply doesn't work very well. Now, the options for carryover are a lot better, because the activity in the soil isn't as long. But if the activity in the soil isn't very long, will anybody actually be using the herbicide anyway? So I've been grouping on the 10 herbicide classes. I group those according to their classifications, simply as a way to get more information kind of covered. But as you may already know, one really has to identify the individual active ingredient in each herbicide to understand the potential for carryover. So I can talk about growth regulators, and I can talk about HPPDs, and I can talk about ALS. But within each class, each chemical active ingredient is going to be different, and it's going to have different effects potentially on the cast crop following it and the cover crop. So those are all important details. The date of your herbicide application. Again, it speaks to what I just talked about. So there, a lot of times our pre-emergent herbicides, we typically have a little bit more flexibility than if we're talking about a post-applied herbicide in June or July or even later than that. Then we run into some roadblocks. The date of cover crop seeding. Traditional cover crops are seeded sometime depending on region, maybe starting in maybe late July through August, September, extending all the way through October and November. The later we go, it stands to reason, maybe the less concern we have for carryover. One consideration that we're talking more about these days is interseeding. And when we're talking about interseeding, then that opens up a whole new conversation from a carryover concern. Is it really carryover? Because we're throwing a cover crop seed out there during the time that we're asking our herbicides to actually keep our weed pressures down. So interseeding adds a whole nother level of complexity, and typically interseeding work best when we're working with burn down herbicides or herbicides that do not have a very long half-life. And then finally, the cover crop application method. Much like the date of seeding, the method of seeding will affect the seeding depth, and that can have an effect on the chances of herbicide interaction. So we've went through the 10 classes. Some of them have issues with carryover, and some, quite frankly, do not. So what we'll do is we'll kind of hit on some of the ones that do typically show more of a concern, and we'll do those not in any particular order, but we'll kind of put them in order at the end. We'll start with the growth regulators. Again, those were the 2,4-Ds and the dicambas, and I've got a few of those other herbicides listed. Now, I know that there's several different, for every common name, there's several different herbicides out there. I tried to list some of the ones that people might be a little bit more familiar with, but growth regulators are typically used in, or they are used in grass cash crops for broadleaf control. And that includes 2,4-D, dicamba, like Clarity, Banville, your stingers, and then a couple other ones as well. But we'll talk about 2,4-D. So broadleaves, we've seen broadleaves be a real issue if planting directly after application. So with 2,4-D use, if we're waiting 30 days, we typically don't have too much of an issue. When we're talking about dicamba, which would be Clarity and Banville, we really need to wait the 120 days. After that, usually not a problem at all. With the Stinger or Sure Start, no matter the rate, and again, assuming that it's somewhat still in the opportune time to be spraying that active ingredient, we've still seen that show up as an issue with some legumes, probably more small-seeded legumes like crimson clover, just clovers in general. And then the last, triclopyr and quinclorac, we've noticed a couple issues with legumes, but I gotta be honest, the only times that I've ever heard of issues with those two products have been actually turf related. So many of these herbicides are also used in the turf industry, and those two are used quite widely in the turf industry. And I've seen a couple oversprays next to a golf course that kept some cover crops from some cover crop legumes from establishing. So that's kind of a summary on the growth regulators. Let's go to the PPO inhibitors. So these are herbicides used primarily in soybeans for broadleaf control. Sharpen is gaining more use as an option for annual ryegrass control. We really don't see a lot of concerns with that. It has a very short plant back restriction, so it's got a lot of versatility. As a PPO, it works fairly well. Flexstar and Reflex, so these have a little shorter half-life, but we still seem to see some issues with radish and rapeseed, a lot of our brassicas, and even our smaller seeded legumes like clovers. Again, not always, but because these are typically, or not all the time, but sometimes they're sprayed really late in the soybean season, those tend to show up with more issues. The Cobra and Phoenix, again, probably more of a concern with just the radish and the rapeseed, not as much of a concern with legumes there. We go down to Spartan, which is your authority, and authority has been causing some issues for a long time. Authority is used in a lot of different herbicides as a premix or in premix herbicides. So most issues that we see are with brassicas and small seeded legumes. We typically don't see any issues with grasses like annual ryegrass, but we have seen it with cereal rye. So again, it kind of catches everything. I'm not saying that we can't use it. It's just it's one of the ones out there that we put a star next to because we do see issues across the board. With Valor, typically what we see is legumes, and not just smaller seeded legumes, but all legumes. I've heard of all legumes having issues with Valor. Don't see as much of an issue with brassicas with Valor. So again, even though all of these are under the PPO inhibitor class, there are some differences between some of the main or common herbicides being used today. A lot of issues, probably more so with legumes than we do see with brassicas, a little bit with cereal rye, if we're talking, or wheat, we're talking about authority, but not typically a concern for like annual ryegrass. On to the triazines. So triazines are herbicides used in corn and soybeans and a wide range of other cash crops. A couple examples of those would be atrazine, simazine, which is Princep. Syncor is another one from the triazine family. Atrazine and Princep generally cause some concern for legumes, but have limited issues for grasses and cereals. We don't really see an issue. Very rarely do I hear of any issues with brassicas after atrazine or Princep. Syncor also really don't see any issues with grasses, but we have seen a little bit of issue with crimson clover and other clovers. If we can keep our rates lower, like especially with atrazine, we really don't see a ton of problems out there. We got a lot more flexibility if we can keep our rates lower. We start adding, 2 pounds of atrazine to a lot of different things, and that's going to increase the issue or the concern, as do higher pH soils. Next would be the ALS inhibitor. So this group encompasses a huge amount of chemistries out there, and these herbicides are used in corn and soybeans for broadleaf control. So I've got a few of them listed: Raptor, Pursuit, Classic, First Rate, Permit, Resolve, Python, Peak, Harmony. But there's a ton of others. Just going to hit on a few here that again, these are ones that I hear of from our dealers out there, and these are typically a little bit more common, some more common than others. Classic can be an issue for sure. With clovers and brassicas, it's definitely more persistent in high pH soils. You get above 7.5 is when you're going to see issues with Classic. Other than that, we don't necessarily see a lot of it. I'm going to jump down to Raptor and First Rate. I'll come back to Pursuit. Raptor and First Rate, they both have a little bit longer soil activity, and Raptor is more sensitive in acidic soil, so it's one of the ones where we have a little lower pH, and potentially we could see some more carryover issues with Raptor. Both Raptor and First Rate have caused issues, typically with brassicas. We'll go to Resolve Q, very versatile option within the ALS family. I have never heard of an issue so far with Resolve, not to say that there's none out there, but listening to people in the field and industry leaders, I don't think I've heard anybody ever say that they've had an issue with Resolve. Now let's jump back up to Pursuit. Pursuit has always been an issue, partially because it has very long soil activity. So brassicas and legumes all kind of fall under the hammer of Pursuit at times. Even a spring oat typically doesn't work very well after Pursuit. So Pursuit is another one within the ALS family that really shows some issues, kind of like Authority earlier within the PPOs. Pursuit is kind of a one that we need to put a star next to. And as you guys all know, Pursuit's been around for quite a while. ACCase inhibitors. So these would be herbicides like Assure, Select, Post, Post Plus. They're typically used in soybeans for grass control. The only issues that I've ever heard of, ever been a part of, are typically been with planting annual ryegrass too soon after application. Don't really hear of any issues with brassicas or legumes as we talk about the ACCase inhibitors, but I'm sure there's maybe an issue out there somewhere, but I've never heard of it. Since these are grass killers, that stands to reason why annual ryegrass might show some concern. Okay, we've only got a couple more left here. HPPD inhibitors. So these herbicides are used primarily in corn for broadleaf control. So with these, that would be the Balance, the Callisto, Lotus, Impact. Mostly what we've seen is that grass cover crops are going to be okay, especially after 3 to 4 months. We don't run into a lot of issues because these are grass herbicides, or these are herbicides sprayed in grass cash crops. But with legumes and brassicas, there's where it probably opens the door up for a little bit more of an issue. With Balance, the more moisture, the less concern. It takes moisture for Balance, for that chemistry to work, to be activated to actually suppress or terminate, kill weed pressures. So the more moisture we get, for sure, the less concern we have with Balance. With Callisto and Lotus too, the only issues I've ever heard of was with legumes, and typically I only hear it with crimson clover, Brasine clover. We've seen it show up in some Balanza clovers, and then brassicas. I don't hear a lot of issues with brassicas, quite frankly, and that might be a little bit of a variance from other people in the industry. But I've not heard, and I don't see a ton of issues with radish and rapeseed and some of the other brassicas after both Callisto and Lotus. I might be the only one in the room, but that's what we've seen. And then Impact. So Impact, even though it has a short half-life, can cause some issues. So the only concern has been the clovers and brassicas, but I hear of all of them on the list, I probably hear more of an issue with Impact than I do anything else. And again, I think it stands to kudos to Impact and that chemistry for doing this job out there. It's just potentially given us some issues as it concerns to planting cover crops. Okay, lastly, the seedling growth inhibitors. So these would be, again, on the shoot inhibitors, these would be Dual, Harness, Outlook, Warrant, Zidua. These are all examples. These herbicides are used to control grass. So grass cover crops have been the ones that have shown the most damage. Most of these, though, have short soil activity. So there's a lot of times where potentially we think we might have an issue, or we're trying to forecast an issue, but nothing ever shows up. We've seen some issues on some stands of legume establishment, but I haven't heard very much of that. On occasion, we do see that from time to time. With the root inhibitors like Prowl and Treflan, again, these have been around for a long time. Typically, our small-seeded legumes like clovers have shown some injury, but most generally, brassicas are okay. Our cereal crops are okay. Annual ryegrass has potentially shown, we think, maybe some establishment issues with Prowl Treflan, but because Prowl and Treflan and some of these root inhibitors typically are incorporated into the soil earlier on in the year, generally we don't hear of a lot of issues with the root inhibitors. So if I'm going to summarize and put our key takeaways all on one slide, what we generally hear and see. Again, this is according to Scott Woltman, not according to, or Scott Woltman and our team, not according to necessarily anybody else. But if I had to rank them from least to most worrisome, I would do it this way. I would put your ACCase herbicides, and again, I'm not listing your glyphosates or your glufosinate, which would be Liberty, or your paraquat, which would be your gramoxone. I'm not listing those. I'm just listing the key residuals that we've seen have issues. The ACCH would be, again, we've seen some injury with annual ryegrass, but that's typically been it. The growth regulators like 2,4-D and dicamba only see some injury to legumes. We next go to the seedling growth inhibitors. Again, some clover damage here and there, some slight stunning to annual ryegrass. And I know I'm grouping these. We shouldn't be doing this necessarily in a group, but in general, I think it's safe to put them in this kind of classification. Your triazines like atrazine, Princeps, Syncor, primarily what we see, guys, is legume damage, if we're going to see anything at all. PPO inhibitors like Flexstar, Authority, there we run into issues with legume and brassica establishment, and now we're getting into the heavier hitters, your HPPDs like Callisto laudus. We see injury to legumes. Again, I don't see as much injury with brassicas. We have seen some damage to annual ryegrass and cereal crops as well. And then your ALS herbicides. I would put these as the biggest headache. We talk about ALS, we talk about Pursuit and some of these other options out there. We've seen issues, again, depending on soil type and soil texture and pH. We've seen some of the ALS herbicides cause some real headaches out there. So that's kind of a summary of what we've seen with some of the main residual herbicides on the market. When we're talking about forages, that kind of opens up a whole another conversation. Most herbicide labels are going to list a plant back restriction that limit how soon a crop can be planted after a herbicide application. We've talked about that already. But with forages or grazing restrictions, they're a little bit different. Ideally, if planting a fall planted cover crop for forage following corn or soybean, a herbicide crop rotation interval or plant back restriction would be short enough that it would allow the forage crop to be established prior to winter. But if the forage crop you're intending to plant is not listed on the label, here's the kicker: you must follow the rotation restriction listed for other crops in parentheses, or in parentheses, other crops. That rotation, and typically that rotation restriction for a forage cover crop is always dictated by the species in the forage mixture with the longest plant back restriction. So I think we all understand that herbicide residues can really affect our forage cover crop growth or cause the cover crop to not come up at all. On top of that, and again, here's another kicker, the herbicide residues can be taken up into the forage cover crop, and that could be toxic to livestock and potentially accumulate in their fat, meat, milk, and potentially pass that into the human food supply. So in the case of regular cover crops used for covers, the grower assumes the risk for planting those. We've talked a lot today about the issues that we've seen out in the field, but we really haven't talked about the herbicide label, because if a cover crop is just going to be used for a cover crop and not fed as forage, the grower assumes the risk of going against that label. But if a cover crop is going to be used for forage, then it's a whole different deal. The grower, I'll back up. Planting outside of what the label replant restriction permits for forage, that is basically violating the law, because the herbicide label is a legal document and must be followed. So again, if a cover crop is going to be used just for a cover and not fed, they can be planted before the label says the replant restriction allows. But if it's going to be used for forage, you need to make sure you maintain what the label says. That's very, very, very important. And one thing I've added is the same website was shown earlier on the screen from University of Nebraska. It does an unbelievably good job of listing all of the different herbicide options that are out there and their potential to cause issues in forage cover crops and residues. The good thing though about the forage cover crop interaction is that a lot of our pre-plant and pre-emergent herbicides do actually allow for planting of a fall cover crop that could be ultimately used for grazing or forage. Lastly, I want to talk about soil herbicide bioassay. So testing for residuals in our soils can be costly and time consuming. Another way to check germination of different seeds to see if they're going to work in our soils or if the chemical is going to prevent them from coming up is to do a soil bioassay. A couple ways you could do this. You could simply go out and spread. It wouldn't be a bioassay, but you could go out and you could take some seed, maybe seed that you're thinking about planting, and you could spread it out in a small corner of the field and see how it's doing or if it's going to germinate. A quicker and easier way, I think, actually, is to collect soil approximately 1 to 6 inches in depth, put that in some sort of a container, mix it all together. And the reason I go that deep is to collect any of those maybe, deeper herbicide residues that are in the soil. Collect soil, combine it together, and then plant some cover crop seeds, either the ones that you're going to potentially plant in your field or seeds that could signal potential herbicide injury. And I've listed some of the ones that we feel like do a good job of signaling if there is potentially going to be a concern out there. And those are oats, cereal rye, radish, crimson clover, hairy vetch, and winter peas, and then annual ryegrass and sorghum sudan. The little picture of the bag off to the right is a little bioassay kit that we send out to our dealers to do this very, very same test. So I guess in closing, our message as a company to the grower and to our dealers that we work with is that cover crop use has historically been driven more by time or lack of time than anything else. I think the SARE surveys kind of represent that over the last 4 or 5 years, even more so than, and I know a lot of the discussion these days is about commodity prices in the farm economy. But if guys have time and if guys have planned, a lot of times we can make cover crops work. So farmers, retailers need to plan. What goes into that? I think procuring seed is obviously, getting seed procured sooner than later is a big deal. Obviously, allocating labor, it's going to take time and equipment to get your cover crop seeded in the fall. And I would encourage everyone to keep on working on planning even earlier year after year. What does that mean? I think planning out crop rotations makes a lot of sense. Obviously, I think most everyone's doing that anyway. Maybe consider different hybrid and variety maturities, the dry down characteristics of some of our hybrids out there. If something dries down a little bit earlier, maybe it would be more conducive to planting a cover crop, or maybe aerial applying a cover crop into that. And then lastly, arranging for herbicide rotations, what we've talked about. There's so much complexity that goes into figuring out what herbicide you're going to use that's going to fit into your corn and soybean system, let alone try to get one that's going to allow your cover crop to work as well. I think there's just a lot of time and effort and justification accordingly that needs to be spent on making sure that we have kind of selected and fit the right herbicide rotations into our systems. So with that, I think we have a few minutes for a few questions. I hopefully I kind of hit on some of the topics that the agenda kind of laid out. So Laura, I'll kick it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Scott. We do have a couple questions submitted, and if anybody else would like to ask a question, we have some time. As I mentioned before, there is an orange box with a white arrow inside of it. You can just click on that to submit your question. This first question that we have is about specific wait times for some popular corn herbicides. I know you kind of addressed this, Scott, but can you talk about some of the weight limits for those popular corn herbicides, especially for cover crop mixtures that a grower is looking to plant early?
Yeah, so there are many plant back restrictions, or there are many herbicides that have very favorable rotational restriction windows, or I guess we could call it plant back restrictions. So a lot of these range from anywhere from 3 to 4 months all the way up to 10 or 12 months. And again, if we're looking at the label and a potential cover crop is not listed, if we're going off of the label especially for forage purposes, that might be an 18-month restriction. But so many of our pre-emergent herbicides, like Corvus, for instance, Corvus is a popular herbicide. Depending on the crop you would be following after Corvus, you might have a 4-month restriction, might have an 8 or 9-month restriction. For something like alfalfa, though, it might have, closer to an 18-month restriction. So you just got to look at the plant back restriction and the half-life of those and just see kind of what works. And I think that's kind of what the industry's been trying to kind of solve that puzzle anyway. But again, some of our, like I was talking about with forages, some of our pre-emergent or early post applied herbicides, there are several that only have a 4 or 5 month plant back restriction.
All right, thank you, Scott. This other question we received is about herbicide labels, which I know you touched on a little bit. This grower is wondering if a rotation restriction is not addressed on the label, how can he interpret what he can plant? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think in most cases, the label is the label should include plant back restrictions for other crops. Sometimes it might be a little bit harder to find than others, but if there's no information listed, I would seek the help of or you can't find that information. I would seek the help of somebody, whether it's an extension or a partner that they work with on an ag retail or an ag professional CCA to help them identify potentially what challenges there would be. But a label should include the plant back restrictions to several different options. And if it's not listed, and again, if we're talking about forages, then it's gonna fall under other crops, which is typically about 18-month restriction.
All right, thanks, Scott. This question that we have is about, I think it's about someone's title in regards to cover crops. This person is wondering if there are any cover crop and termination specialist consulting designations that should be aware of when requesting advice from experts. Do you know if those designations exist?
So a designation on a cover crop termination expert, I don't know of if that I'm fairly positive it doesn't exist. Now, there are several folks within our industry that have been doing some really, really good work. And again, the websites that I listed earlier, the information presented by those folks would be as good to reach out to those people as anybody that I know in the industry. You got to throw out the likes of people like Mike Plummer as well, who's been doing it a long time. There's several people in the industry that would be good to reach out to, depending on what region you are or what part of the country you're in. But a lot of our land grant universities are actually doing quite a bit of good work, and those would be where I would start.
All right, great. This person is wondering about using half rates of herbicides. If someone is using a half rate, how is that going to impact their any possible carryover to their cover crops?
Well, a half rate, again, whether we're talking about atrazine or something else, half rates will, depending on all the other factors we talked about, weather and soil type and soil texture, pH, the rate is part of that discussion as well. And a lesser rate stands to reason, in theory, that you would have less of an issue with a half rate as you would with a larger or a full rate, or even a more than full rate. So again, though, you're typically not going to, unless you're going to dive deeper into information that might be out there, or from a land grant university, or somebody else that has really done research on, diagnosing the activity you see from a carryover standpoint on a full rate versus a half rate. It's going to be probably some trial and error. But again, I've kind of hit on a few chemicals where if we use some full rates, we're going to have more of an issue. That's just what we've seen out in the field. So I think it makes sense that in some cases, especially with our triazines and maybe not even triazines, but like our duals and our harnesses and things like that, our higher rates that we would have there potentially would cause a problem. So if we can get by and still get the weed control that we want with a lesser rate, and if you're going to be putting a cover crop on that acre, then I think it's probably worth a try. But what you're giving up is you're giving up some residual activity to combat that weed pressure.
All right, thanks, Scott. Well, that is all the questions we've received about herbicide rotations in regards to cover crops. I'll give it another couple minutes to see if anybody else has any further questions.